This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Mr. Peter Rao, a senior fellow and director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute. Mr. Rao previously served as a director of research for the Office of George W. Bush and as an associate director in the White House Office of Strategic Initiatives. Mr. Rao joins us today for a discussion on developments from the recent NATO summit and security implications for Ukraine. Stay with us as we speak with Mr. Peter Rao. Peter, thank you so much for joining the podcast again.
It's my pleasure. I'm at Beach Week in the Outer Banks, North Carolina, but for Michael Allen and this podcast, I, of course, stepped away from lugging gear down to the beach to talk all things Ukraine and foreign policy.
Oh, well, thanks for doing it. I have read that there's some serious sharks in the area, so be careful out there.
I saw some dolphins yesterday, in fact, so maybe that's a good omen.
That's good. We like dolphins. So, Peter, even though you're on Beach Week, people are talking about Ukraine this week in the news. We had planned this even before the recent so-called arms freeze, just to sort of, as the world was watching things in the Middle East, to catch up on what was happening in Europe. But let's go where the news is as of this morning. Apparently, the president yesterday was exasperated. He stated as much with his phone call with Vladimir Putin. He said basically that Putin was full of BS and talked a good game, but apparently isn't interested in making any kind of concessions to end the war. I think to us, Peter, we've been thinking this all along, that if it's Trump versus Putin, Putin is going to take every opportunity to be as obstinate and stubborn as possible and to frustrate Trump. And it looks like that's finally come true. Is that your take on the last few days?
Well, for one, I would say as pleased as President Trump is with his national security team over the negotiations between India and Pakistan. He raises that all the time during that brief flare-up in fighting. He's, I think, equally disappointed with how his Russia policy has unfolded. And to take it into the political realm, he's doubly disappointed that he has to talk about this now. He's coming off of a great week, a win on the big, beautiful bill, as it's become to be known, which is his signature domestic legislative goal for the first several months of his presidency. And now he's being whipsawed back into talking about an issue that splits the Republican base somewhat, and where he'd like to get some distance. And that, of course, I think owes to this weapons freeze that was announced by the Pentagon, in which the president, at least in part, countermanded in recent days. So here we are talking Russia, Ukraine. I don't think the president particularly wants to do that, but he's been forced to do that owing to the weapons freeze, which was much in the news the last few days.
Well, let's check the score here. As I keep up with Russia, Ukraine, we're almost seemingly in the same situation that we've been in for some time. And we can talk about the summer offensive and if there truly is one by the Russians in a second. But it seems to be generally the case that it continues to be a positional war of attrition, with the Russians making incremental progress by sending hundreds of troops per day at the Ukrainian front lines, finally exhausting them where they have to fall back a little bit, but not very much. And certainly, if you applied Western standards, the Russians have put forth way too much in terms of loss of life to justify the amount of territory they're taking. Is that a handle on where we are right now? Or kind of please tell me what you're hearing in the halls of power about the state of the war?
The basic frontline dynamic remains more or less the same. I think there are probably three novelties or new issues that are worth mentioning since the last time we talked. The first is that the Russians launched an offensive in Sumy, which is yet another oblast in Ukraine. That's more or less culminated, and I think is widely regarded as, if not a failure, an inconclusive at best operation that the Russians undertook. And it had many of the hallmarks which you're just describing, which have been characteristics of the war, and that is large-scale Russian losses in return for pretty small I don't even think we can call them breakthroughs, but gains. Secondly, an increase in the air offensive against Ukraine's civilian population and obviously its frontline troops as well. We've seen some of the largest barrages of the war in drones and ballistic missile strikes, which is aimed at hitting Ukraine where it hurts and also wearing down its air defenses. And then third, there have been reports of North Korean forces potentially deploying into Ukraine, which I don't think is confirmed yet, but your listeners will recall that they played a huge role in helping the Russians retake Kursk Oblast. This is what everyone considers part of the Russian Federation, where Ukraine had made an incursion. And now that North Korean force, potentially other forces from North Korea, in pretty significant numbers, may actually deploy into Ukraine itself. So those are the three new dynamics, battlefield related. But by and large, you're right. Russia is slogging its way forward. The Ukrainians are trying to win the attritional battle by taking a pound of flesh for every meter of ground that Russia takes, in the hopes that that equation comes out net benefits for Ukraine, whereas the Russians are calculating that they can achieve their objectives even while taking huge losses before those losses are so significant that the Russians might have to shut down the war.
Okay, great. Let's get to each of these in due course. Let's cover the arms freeze. The way I think it's been reported within the last 48 hours is that coming out of the NATO conference, the president was interested in how our munitions are being expended, given the activity in the Middle East and what we've transferred to Ukraine. And that apparently was interpreted by some in the Department of Defense as an invitation to freeze certain arms from being finally transferred over to the Ukrainians. As I understand it, they may have been, these goods, these arms might have already been in Poland. Can you shed any light on how all of this went down? And then we can talk about Trump's apparent reversal of the Department of Defense.
I think you basically covered it. During the Israeli operation against Iran, the president was interested in our magazine levels, ordered a review, and then the Defense Department bureaucracy took that review and ultimately pushed for a freeze in the last tranche of weapons that would go to Ukraine. As I understand it, without much interagency consultation, without congressional notification, and without really consulting the allies. So it came as a surprise across the board. I will say I think there's something particularly unique about the Trump administration that made this possible, because as I kind of watch President Trump, I think the experience of his first term, his dealings with, for example, Alexander Vindman and others, means that he is less focused on NSC process and the interagency the way other presidents might have. And that makes it possible for a decision like this to be advanced in one agency without proper coordination. But that cuts both ways, because I think the president is also willing to bypass NSC process because he's more confident than he is in the first term, and he wants to be the decider. So these sorts of decisions without consultation, without proper buy-in at the presidential level, which clearly this didn't have, is a decision one takes at one's own kind of professional peril.
Well, I think you're right, and we talk to clients a lot about this as well. It's clear the president is very happy to make decisions. He's happy to make decisions on issues that in previous administrations might have been considered to have been below his pay grade, so to speak. He's willing to get in and take on issues maybe that would be dealt with at a deputies committee meeting or lower. And I think that's indicative of the fact that he's comfortable in the job and likes the job, which is all the more reason, or why all the more curious the issue is that the Department of Defense would have initiated an arms freeze on Ukraine and not checked it with the White House. So I don't know, maybe I know it's a different interagency process as you outlined, but apparently this didn't occur.
It's especially befuddling because this president is more accessible than maybe any president in the recent past. He's certainly more accessible to his cabinet than, say, President Biden was in the Biden administration. So the way I would think kind of policymaking should go is that you go to the White House, you get your instructions, and then you try to implement them in your agency. But anyway, this was a process foul, and we'll see what it means going forward. It just does force the president to talk about this publicly, though, at a time when he has other great jobs and economic data to boast about in the press, when he's got the big, beautiful bill just passed, when he has other elements of his agenda that he's rather proud of in the news, and it just pushes them a little bit off the front line. If these weapons had just shipped as regularly scheduled, they're not an occasion for a big news push, but because of the way that this was handled procedurally, it pushes out stories and criticisms and all the rest, which is probably the last thing the president wants to hear.
And as we talked this morning, it's too soon to say whether these arms that the president intends to ship include all of the ones that were frozen, or maybe he just means the Patriot missiles that he talked about in specificity. We're just going to have to see how that goes in coming days, unless you have an interpret this, unless you feel like it was a solid direction that everything that was frozen should be shipped.
No, I agree with you. It's unclear. And even within the Patriot category, it's unclear whether or not the full number of interceptors is what the president's now agreed with, President Zelensky and others in his phone call with them, whether or not that's where the directive goes. So we don't know, and we'll have to wait to see whether or not it includes the anti-aircraft missiles, the Hellfires, the Gimlers, the Stingers, grenade launchers, the full category of weapons that were in this tranche.
All right. Well, so we're about to go back through the summer offensive and the military situation again, but let me just ask you this, Peter. The president did go over to a NATO summit, basking in the success of the successful Iranian strike on the Iranian missile, well, certainly at least the centrifuge halls. Catch us up on NATO. Is there anything we need to take from that event? Was it just the pledges by the Europeans to go to 5% of GDP? Tell us what we missed.
That was really the heart and soul, not just the heart and soul, but almost the entirety of what the White House was pushing for. And when I checked with the White House, what is it that you're pushing for, asking for, wanting from the NATO summit? The unified answer I got back was a 5% investment pledge from all the allies. So that really was, I think, the focus. That's what the president wanted to accomplish. The summit declaration was short and to the point. It had none of the sort of long, rambling or discretionary language that you have usually in these communiques, but instead was focused on the defense investment pledge. I think that all of the news focus and debate and storm kicked up over the Iran strikes meant that President Trump was really focused on the damage assessment from the strikes, especially against Fordo, and that kind of loomed large in his mind. And so his public posture in Brussels was really focused on defending the strikes, making clear that they actually did destroy the enrichment halls and the facilities in Fordo. And so that's where his attention was in large part focused, in addition to the pledge. And whatever the Europeans and the Canadians might have been worried about, meaning at past NATO summits, the president's taken the Europeans and the Canadians to task, really fell by the wayside because the Iran issue overshadowed and loomed so large. That said, I will also add, if you're going to make a 5% investment pledge, that is what the president's asking for. And his frustration in past NATO summits has been about that issue, NATO defense spending. And so it's not that complex. I mean, I think it's relatively straightforward. Germany in particular, which is the largest economy by an order of magnitude in Europe, hit the 5% pledge. The foreign minister Vadapul agreed to this at the foreign minister in Antalya and said he'd be campaigning for 5% across the NATO alliance. Only Madrid, only the Spaniards as laggards sort of refused to sign up to this agreement. And they got whacked by the president in his closing press conference. And so it really is defense investment pledge. You hit the 5%. The president's pleased, to the point that when Secretary Hegseth went to Shangri-La in the Indo-Pacific and to Singapore, he was saying, not only our European allies can spend 5%, you too all must pick up your defense investment slack to our Indo-Pacific allies. So all of a sudden, the Europeans are the model of defense spending for other regions of the world, which I thought interesting.
That is funny. Do you sign up to this strategic view that because the president apparently succeeded in Iran, that it has repercussions? Certainly, I think Xi Jinping had to wake up and look at President Trump a little bit differently the next day. Do you think there are any positive vibrations that sent into the Russia-Ukraine conflict that will benefit either Ukraine or the United States in the coming weeks?
Well, I think deterrence is a combination of capabilities and will, and this certainly shored up the world's impression of President Trump's willpower and his willingness to see things through. I have to say I was a little disappointed by parts of the European, at least public intelligentsia or kind of commentating, chattering class that were critical of the strike, given that the little political capital that Europeans have with the White House, or maybe it's significant political capital, should probably be trained on pushing the president forward on Russia, Ukraine, not pulling him back on Iran, Israel. I think that Iran as one component, and the reason I say that is because the Europeans regularly say to us, Iran is one component of this broader axis of revisionists: China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. And if that's the case, then in the next breath, a strike against Iran and a weakening of Iran, ipso facto, sort of logically, also weakens Russia. Russia has now produced or brought in-house a lot of the production of its drones, but it's relied a lot on Iran in the past, and this weakened Iran in dramatic ways, and also undermined in part the Iranian-Russian relationship, I think. So yeah, I think it matters. It showed willpower, it showed decisive attitude, and it showed that the president's prepared under certain conditions to use force, and I think that's important as well.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Peter Rao.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Okay, so let's go to the military situation that you outlined coming in. The Sumy offensive, when we talk about summer offensives, that's of course because the winter is wet and miserable, and apparently the armored vehicles and tanks have a hard time moving on. So that's why it feels like we're back in the 1800s when we talk about summer offensives. But is this the extent of the Russian offensive, the Sumy operation that you mentioned? Do they have other tricks up their sleeve, or are they just basically limited in what they can do?
Well, Ukraine's top military commander, Alexander Syrskyi, did warn a few days ago of a possible new Russian offensive in the Kharkiv region. So there are various plans in the work, seemingly, and the Russians want to push here and there. And I basically think of Vladimir Putin as an opportunist. So if he thinks that he can stretch lines, find weakness, he will push and urge his commanders to push. But a little bit like after that, if you remember that impressive operation that the Ukrainians ran inside of Russia, where they hit Russia's strategic bombers via these drones transported on lorries and trucks deep into Russia. A lot of press came to me and asked, what's the Russian response going to be? And I said, well, they are throwing everything they have at this war. It isn't like there's some sort of big reserve or there's some sort of magic bullet or silver bullet that Putin has at his disposal. If he had it, he would use it. There are W&D options he has available to him, but those carry enormous downside risks as well. And, it's a separate discussion we can have. But I don't think that the Russians have this army up its sleeve that it's been holding in reserve for 3 years while it's taking 1 million casualties. Instead, it's really doing everything it can. And so here and there might be a push, but I don't see the fundamentals of the war as changing right now.
So while we're on the fundamentals of the war, and I think I maybe even mentioned this to you last time we did one of these podcasts back in March. It still feels that the media and expert testimony are all over the map on whether or not the Russian economy is doing well. Is it irretrievably harmed because of its focus? Is it just a wartime economy now? Is it being fed by oil and gas? What do you and your think tanks and then the experts that you run with think on the state of the Russian economy and its effect on the war?
Well, interestingly enough, the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, which took place last month, it used to be a showcase for international business in Russia. That's now been reduced to a much more Russian-centric conversation. But during the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, the economy minister of Russia, Maxim Reshetnikov, delivered a warning where he essentially said that that there's a cooling, and it seems to me that we may be on the brink of a recession, if I remember that quote correct. He was subsequently rebuked by another high-ranking Russian official, but I think it was the central bank governor, who's widely regarded as impressive and effective, who took a different reading on it. But my read is that basically the Russians, they have run a budget deficit each year of 30 to 40 billion US dollars. They're going to run at least a 30 to 40 billion dollar budget deficit. I think they're projected to run that this year, and about what they have left in their national sovereign wealth, liquid, accessible holdings, cuts to about that amount. So those are very rough estimates. They depend upon the price of oil, obviously, but that means that, the Russians at some point are going to have to either raise money in international markets, and they're not going to be able to do that. The Chinese have been unwilling to rescue them. Their domestic bond auctions have failed. And so you can raise taxes, you can cut social outlays, or you can rethink some of your expenditures. And that's going to be a choice that's going to hit the Russians at some point in late 2025, if not, 2026.
So, well, that's interesting. Why 2025? Why haven't we seen it sooner?
I think it's just the numbers, the amount of budget deficit that they've run, they've been able to cover with their national wealth fund, but that will run dry at some point. It's not an inexhaustible number. And so if the West does, for example, tap the hundreds of billions of dollars in frozen Russian assets in Belgian accounts and transfers those in various ways and forms to the Ukrainian war effort, you can begin to create really difficult timelines for the Russians and begin to engender in Putin the true spirit of compromise that President Trump might be looking for. I think that's probably the best bet and the argument that a lot of European leaders are making to the president.
Okay, so let's tighten that up. For those of us who support a greater U.S. role in continuing to arm the Ukrainians, what is that the best case argument? I mean, what do we want to advocate for? We want to advocate for additional sanctions on the Russian economy, additional and continued military and intelligence assets. One, because we think things might change significantly in Russia, at least in the Russian economy in 2025. But what else? What else are we essentially saying? Because I don't think we could argue that Ukraine needs help in perpetuity. I don't know that that's politically saleable for the modern Republican Party. What do you think?
I think the basic question is whether or not the current strategy is sufficient to meet President Trump's stated policy goal. His stated policy goal is twofold. One, to shut down the war, but two, to shut down the war in a way that leaves Ukraine a sovereign and viable state. So to accomplish that goal, you probably have to improve Ukraine's position and worsen Russia's position. I think that intelligence assets, support for the Ukrainian war effort when it comes to data sharing, et cetera, is a start, a necessary prerequisite, probably not a sufficient condition. On sanctions, I wonder whether or not the sanctions architecture isn't already pretty robust. It just needs tougher implementation, turning the screws. And then beyond that, we can look at additional measures. And on weapons, there probably needs to be more weapons to Ukraine, but there are creative ways of approaching this. The Europeans are apparently arguing to President Trump, who's now urging the Europeans to send more patriots, that their numbers as a percentage of their own force have been growing even lower than American patriot numbers. That's all well and good. Of course, the Europeans, while they do face Russia on their border, don't have a China contingency to worry about the way we do, and so you could put that back in their camp. But there are creative ways, like direct military sales of American defense industrial kit to the Ukrainians, or even to the Europeans to backfill what they're offering the Ukrainians. The point is, the Ukrainians need more weapons. They need tighter sanctions enforcement. They definitely need intelligence support, and all of that should hopefully make clear to the Russians that we're in this. That we're there to support a not a morally satisfied conclusion. No one's arguing that we're going to retake Mariupol, but that they can't, for example, demand parts of Oblast, which they haven't even been able to commandeer on the battlefield.
All right, that sounds really good. Let me ask you, where do we think, or how do we think Zelensky's relationship is right now with the president?
I think it's pretty good. I mean, I've heard a lot of rumblings that the president doesn't particularly like President Zelensky, that the relationship obviously got off on a terrible start in the Oval Office meeting. But based on the phone call that they held after this weapons shutoff was made public, it seems like their relationship is about as good as it's been. And right now, I'm convinced that the president believes the problem for war termination is with Moscow. It's not with Kyiv. And so, despite all the hiccups and early problems, the U.S. and Ukraine seem more or less on the same page. The U.S. and Russia are not.
If you have to go back and track the turnaround of their relationship, everybody seems to say it was the Pope's funeral in the Vatican where they met. Is that how it happened? Is that essentially how it's going?
I don't know. It's a good question. I don't think it was that quick. I think it took some time. But by the way, just as a parenthetical, here is the Pope's funeral, the death of the pontiff. And even then, Donald Trump is the center of attention. Like, his ability to just be the center of the action with that iconic photo of him and President Zelensky in St. Peter's in their face-to-face meeting is just something to be marveled at. But I think it was subsequently, I think it took time, it was incremental, and it probably reached its high point in the phone call they had in recent days. Meanwhile, I think the relationship with Putin has been equally incremental on a downward trajectory, whereas the Russians just have run out of means of delay and obfuscation without President Trump saying, look, you're just tapping me along, as he put it. It might, the moment might be, I mean, this is a little bit of conjecture, but if you remember, the president went to the Gulf and President Putin tried to push for a meeting, and President Zelensky said, okay, let's meet face to face in Turkey. I mean, he basically called the Russian bluff. And then Putin, of course, didn't show up. Trump said that he might have been interested had Putin shown up to go to Turkey as well. And that might have been, if one thinks about it, on the graph almost of Putin's declining capital with Trump and Zelensky's increasing improved ties with Trump, the point of intersection where Zelensky sort of surpassed Putin.
Yeah, I hear you. That's good. I like that you plotted it out there. As we begin to wrap up, let's talk, and you alluded to this, about Europeans paying for American defense systems, but let's just talk about the politics of it all. The Reagan Strategy Group, or the Reagan Foundation, recently put out a poll that showed that Americans are not isolationists. I think that they believe that Russia winning the Russian-Ukraine war isn't good for the United States, but they don't necessarily support in broad numbers helping Ukraine. They feel like we've done a lot so far. Do you think that's broadly true? And if it is, how is the United States, how do we sell the idea that the United States should continue to support Ukraine going in? Is it that they're going to borrow against the critical minerals agreement? Is it that the frozen assets are going to pay for U.S. weapon systems? Is it that the Europeans are going to pay the United States defense contractors for weapon systems to be transferred to the Ukrainians? How does this whole thing look as you try to stretch the funding into, 2026?
Well, I think it's really hard to... first of all, I'll just preface this by saying I don't doubt that the Republican Party believes in American leadership in the world. I think that still is a core tenet that undergirds a lot of Republican voters' basic attitudes toward the world. Having said that, I think it's really hard to poll a party or a set of voters when they have the White House, because oftentimes you end up polling the sentiments of people who are basically looking to see what the president believes, especially on foreign policy matters. There's polling data that shows that Republican voters support the Gaza Riviera because President Trump essentially was pushing for it, and so as good loyal Republicans are supporting their president's views. But how much does that actually capture underlying trends or underlying views? It's hard to say. But that also means there's an opportunity, which is if the president swings behind an idea, I think Republican voters are likely to do so as well. And the fact that an idea like the war in Ukraine, which is so closely associated and synonymous with Joe Biden for 3 years and arguably even to this day, captures a significant plurality, if not majority of Republican voters, is something. I mean, any other issue like that associates with Joe Biden, immigration, tax policy, healthcare, you name it, I'm venturing to say that Republican voters in the single digits might support him, if even that. So I think there's a healthy support there, but it's very closely attached to President Trump's attitudes. And I've argued the way forward probably is a combination of what you've said. I don't know, you could borrow against the critical minerals agreement. That might be a bit of a thin read, but certainly accessing the frozen assets in Belgium is an option. And getting Europe, my understanding is Chancellor Merz, the new German chancellor, in a call with the president in the last few days, made a pitch for Europe to finance American systems for Ukraine. That's something I think the president can take to his voters and say, this differentiates me from President Biden. He gave these things away. I'm paying for them, or the Europeans are paying for them. But, this takes us back to the start of our conversation about our defense industrial base shortages. And at some point, we have to get control over that. And in the end, these monies, especially European investments or frozen assets going into these sorts of investments, should help produce an improvement in our defense industrial base. It's still surprising to me that here we are 3 years plus after the start of the war, and we're still talking about some of these problems.
Peter Rao, thank you so much for joining NatSec Matters, and hope to have you back again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
That was Peter Rao. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.